Hello, my dear friends. My name is Sarah, and today I want to share something very personal with you. I'm sitting here now as an older woman, calmer than I've ever been, and I've found peace in my life. But the journey to get here wasn't easy. What I'm about to share is not easy to say, but I survived. My father betrayed me, and he betrayed my mother, and for a time I thought there was no way out. The pain I experienced was unimaginable, and I had to make decisions that no one should ever have to make. But I made a choice that saved me. And I want to share that journey with you because I believe my story can help others. I know there are people watching this who might be going through their own struggles, their own pain, their own feelings of being trapped. If you've been through something similar, you are not alone. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and know that healing is possible. Together, we are stronger. Sometimes just knowing that someone else has walked this path and made it through can give us the strength we need to take our next step. I want you to like this video and subscribe to my channel if my story resonates with you. But more importantly, I want you to comment and share your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so. There might be someone else watching who needs to hear your story too. I want to take you back to a time when I thought my family was normal, when my father was a figure of authority in my life. This was the calm before the storm, the time before my world turned upside down. Looking back now, I can see the signs that I missed as a child, but at the time, everything seemed like it was the way families were supposed to be. But through it all, as I tell you this story, I want you to remember that this story has hope, and it has healing at the end. No matter how dark things get in my telling, remember that I'm here now, whole and at peace, speaking to you with strength in my voice. That's the destination we're heading toward together. I want to take you back to my childhood, to a time when everything seemed perfectly normal and safe. I was just a little girl then, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with pigtails in my hair and scraped knees from playing outside. My world was small but felt complete. Our house was a modest 2-story home on Maple Street, with a white picket fence and a garden that my mother tended to with such love and care. In those early years, I believed we were the picture-perfect family. My father was a central figure in our household, and back then, I trusted him completely. I saw him as my protector, my guide, the man who would always keep me safe from the world outside our front door. He was tall and strong, with hands that seemed capable of fixing anything that broke. When the kitchen faucet leaked, he would grab his toolbox and make it work like new. When my bicycle chain came off, he would kneel down in the driveway and patiently put it back together while I watched in amazement. I loved both my parents deeply, but I had a special connection with my mother. She was gentle and kind, with a laugh that could fill our entire house with warmth. She would braid my hair every morning before school, telling me stories about her own childhood while her fingers worked through the tangles. She smelled like vanilla and lavender, and when she hugged me, I felt like nothing bad could ever happen in the world. My father was someone who was respected not just in our family, but throughout our entire community. He worked at the local bank, wearing crisp white shirts and dark ties every morning as he headed off to work. Our neighbors would wave to him as he walked down the street, and he would tip his hat in response. At church on Sundays, people would shake his hand and ask his opinion on matters of importance. I felt proud to be his daughter, proud to carry his last name. I have so many early fond memories with him that even now, after everything that happened, I can close my eyes and remember the good times. He would take me fishing at the old pond behind our house on Saturday mornings. We would sit there in comfortable silence, watching our bobbers float on the still water while he taught me how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment. He showed me how to bait a hook, how to cast the line just right, and how to reel in a fish without letting it get away. On summer evenings, he would push me on the tire swing that hung from the big oak tree in our backyard. I would pump my legs as hard as I could, trying to reach the clouds, while he stood nearby making sure I was safe. He would catch fireflies with me in mason jars, and we would sit on the front porch steps, watching them glow like tiny lanterns in the gathering darkness. During winter months, he would help me build snowmen in our front yard. His hands were so much bigger than mine, but he would let me pack the snow and decide where the buttons should go. He would lift me up to place the carrot nose at just the right height, and then step back to admire our creation together. These moments felt magical to me then. They were the foundation of trust that I built my whole world upon. He read me bedtime stories every night, sitting on the edge of my bed with a worn book of fairy tales in his lap. His voice would change for each character, becoming high and squeaky for the mice, deep and gruff for the bears. I would laugh and ask him to do the voices again and again. He never seemed to grow tired of my requests, never made me feel like I was asking for too much. But as I look back now with the wisdom that comes from surviving what I survived, I can see that there were subtle signs even then that something wasn't quite right. At the time, I couldn't understand why certain moments felt off, why there were shadows creeping around the edges of what seemed like a perfect family picture. I began to notice that my father's behavior started to shift in small ways that I couldn't quite put my finger on. There would be moments when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, when his laugh sounded forced and hollow. Sometimes I would catch him staring at nothing, his jaw clenched tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. When I would ask him what was wrong, he would shake his head and tell me it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. The emotional outbursts started gradually. At first, they seemed like normal frustrations that any adult might have. He would raise his voice when dinner wasn't ready on time, or when he couldn't find his car keys in the morning. But slowly, these moments became more frequent and more intense. His anger would flash hot and sudden over things that seemed so small to me. If my mother forgot to iron his shirts exactly the way he liked them, he would storm around the house slamming doors and muttering under his breath. I began to notice a growing need in him to control everything in our household. He wanted to know where my mother was going every time she left the house, even if it was just to run to the grocery store. He would check the receipts when she came home, questioning every purchase, asking why she bought this brand instead of that one, why she spent an extra 50 cents on something he didn't think we needed. He started making rules about everything: what time we ate dinner, what television shows we were allowed to watch, how loud we could talk, how we should sit at the dinner table. The rules seemed to multiply every week, and they changed without warning. Something that was acceptable one day would suddenly be forbidden the next, and when I would forget and break one of these new rules, I could see the disappointment and anger flash across his face. My mother began to walk on eggshells around him, and I found myself doing the same thing without really understanding why. We would exchange glances across the dinner table, silent communications that said we both felt the tension growing in our house like a thunderstorm building on the horizon. She would give me little warning looks when she could sense his mood starting to turn, and I learned to read those signals and make myself small and quiet. At first, I couldn't understand why things felt so different. This was the same man who had taught me how to ride my bicycle, holding onto the back of the seat and running alongside me until I found my balance. This was the same father who had bandaged my scraped knees and kissed away my tears when I fell down. But gradually, I began to see that there were cracks forming in what had seemed like such a solid foundation. The perfect family image that I had believed in so completely was beginning to crumble around the edges. The man I had trusted with my whole heart was changing into someone I didn't recognize, someone who made me feel nervous and uncertain in my own home. The house that had always felt like the safest place in the world was starting to feel like somewhere I needed to be careful, somewhere I needed to watch my step. I was too young to understand what was happening, too innocent to recognize the warning signs that were appearing all around me. All I knew was that something fundamental was shifting in my world, and I didn't know how to stop it or how to make things go back to the way they used to be. The trust I had placed in my father, the complete faith I had in his love and protection, was about to be shattered in ways I never could have imagined. The changes were so gradual that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Children have such a powerful need to believe that their parents are good, that their home is safe, that their world makes sense. I kept telling myself that maybe I was just being too sensitive, maybe I was reading too much into normal adult behavior. But deep down, something inside me was starting to feel afraid, though I didn't have the words to express what that fear was about. I remember one particular evening when everything felt different. We were having dinner, and my mother had made my father's favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans from our garden. The food smelled wonderful, and I was excited because pot roast nights usually meant my father would be in a good mood. But as we sat around the table, I could feel something electric in the air, something tense and unpredictable. My mother asked him about his day at work, the same question she asked every evening. But instead of his usual response about meetings and customers, he just stared at her for a long moment. His eyes had a hardness in them that I had never seen before. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and measured. He told her that he didn't want to talk about work, that he was tired of her constant questions, that maybe she should focus more on keeping the house clean instead of worrying about things that didn't concern her. I watched my mother's face fall, saw the hurt flash across her features before she quickly composed herself and apologized. She had spent the entire day cleaning our house from top to bottom, as she did every day, but she didn't defend herself. She just nodded and said she was sorry, that she hadn't meant to pry. I wanted to tell her that she had done nothing wrong, that the house was spotless and beautiful, but something told me to stay quiet, to make myself invisible. The rest of that dinner was eaten in silence. I could hear every sound magnified, the clink of forks against plates, the tick of the clock on the kitchen wall, the sound of my own breathing. My father ate methodically, never looking up, while my mother picked at her food, and I tried to disappear into my chair. That night marked the beginning of many silent dinners in our house. My mother started changing too, in response to my father's shifting moods. She became more careful, more anxious, always trying to anticipate what might set him off. She would spend extra time making sure his coffee was exactly the right temperature in the morning. She would check and double-check that his shirts were ironed perfectly, that his shoes were polished, that everything in the house was exactly as he liked it. I began to see her studying his face when he came home from work, trying to gauge his mood before deciding what to say or do. If he seemed calm, she might risk asking about his day or sharing some small piece of news from her own activities. But if she sensed tension in his posture or irritation in his voice, she would become almost invisible, moving quietly through the house, speaking in whispers, making sure nothing she did would draw his attention or displeasure. As a child, I started mimicking her behavior without really understanding why. I learned to read the signs too, to recognize when it was safe to laugh and play, and when I needed to be quiet and still. I began to understand that there were good days and bad days in our house, and that it was my job to figure out which kind of day it was and behave accordingly. The weekends became particularly unpredictable. Sometimes my father would wake up in a wonderful mood, suggesting family activities like going to the park or driving to the ice cream shop. On those days, he would be charming and funny, telling jokes and playing games with me, acting like the father I remembered from my earliest years. But other weekends, he would wake up dark and brooding, finding fault with everything and everyone around him. I remember one Saturday morning when I was particularly excited because I had learned a new song at school that I wanted to sing for him. I had been practicing it all week, getting the words just right, imagining how proud he would be when I performed it. But when I approached him that morning with my eager smile and began to sing, he looked at me with such annoyance that I stopped mid-sentence. He told me that my singing was giving him a headache, that children should be seen and not heard, and that I should find something quiet to do instead. I ran to my room and cried into my pillow, confused about why something that had seemed so wonderful to me could make him so angry. My mother came to comfort me later, explaining that Daddy was just tired and didn't mean what he said. But even at my young age, I was beginning to understand that his tiredness seemed to come and go in ways that didn't make sense to me. School became my refuge during this time. At school, I could be myself without worrying about anyone's mood or walking on eggshells. My teachers were kind and predictable. My friends were silly and carefree, and I could laugh without checking first to see if it was allowed. But even at school, I found myself becoming more watchful, more cautious. I would study the faces of my teachers and classmates, looking for signs of anger or disapproval, preparing myself to change my behavior if needed. I started having trouble sleeping during this period. I would lie in my bed at night, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to interpret what I was hearing. Were my parents talking normally downstairs, or were their voices tense and strained? Was that the sound of my father pacing in his study, or was he sitting calmly reading his newspaper? I became an expert at distinguishing between different types of footsteps, different tones of voice, different qualities of silence. The little girl who had once felt completely safe and protected in her own home was learning to be constantly alert, constantly prepared for something to go wrong. I didn't understand what was happening to my family, but I could feel it changing, could sense that the solid ground I had always stood on was becoming less and less stable with each passing day. Looking back now, I can see that this was the beginning of my education in survival. I was learning skills that no child should have to learn, developing instincts that would serve me well in the difficult years ahead, even though I wouldn't understand their importance until much later. I was learning to read people, to sense danger, to protect myself in small ways, to find strength in the midst of confusion and fear. But I want you to remember, as I tell you this part of my story, that even in the darkness that was coming, even in the pain that was ahead, there was still hope. There was still a little girl inside me who deserved love and safety and protection. And eventually, that little girl would find the strength to save herself, to reclaim her life, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of what was broken. The foundation of trust may have been cracking, but the foundation of my own inner strength was just beginning to form. The transition from subtle changes to outright abuse didn't happen overnight. It was like watching a storm slowly gather on the horizon, seeing the dark clouds building, feeling the pressure in the air change, but not knowing exactly when the lightning would strike. I was still just a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old by this time, trying to navigate a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable and frightening. The emotional manipulation started first, though I didn't have words for what was happening to me then. My father began using tactics that would make me question my own reality, my own perceptions, my own worth. He would say things to me that felt like poison seeping into my young mind, statements designed to make me feel small and powerless and completely dependent on his approval. He started telling me that I was too sensitive, that I imagined problems that didn't exist, that I was making mountains out of molehills. When I would try to express concern about his angry outbursts or his treatment of my mother, he would laugh and tell me that I was being dramatic, that I watched too much television and couldn't tell the difference between real life and make-believe. He made me feel like my own feelings and observations couldn't be trusted. The verbal abuse escalated gradually from there. What started as occasional harsh words during bad moods became a regular pattern of criticism and cruelty. He would find fault with everything I did, everything I said, everything I was. My schoolwork was never good enough. My appearance was always lacking in some way. My personality was too loud or too quiet, too outgoing or too shy, depending on his mood and what he felt like attacking that particular day. He had a way of delivering these verbal attacks that was particularly devastating. He would wait until I was feeling happy or confident about something, and then he would tear me down with surgical precision. If I came home excited about a good grade on a test, he would tell me that the test must have been too easy, that anyone could have done well on it. If I was proud of a drawing I had made, he would point out every flaw, every imperfection, until I wanted to throw it away and never try to create anything again. The psychological impact of this constant criticism was profound. I began to internalize his voice, to hear his judgments echoing in my own thoughts, even when he wasn't around. I started second-guessing everything I did, everything I thought, everything I felt. The confident, joyful child I had once been was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who was constantly anxious, constantly afraid of making mistakes, constantly seeking approval that would never come. My mother was experiencing her own form of abuse during this time, and I could see the toll it was taking on her as well. He would belittle her in front of me, making cruel comments about her cooking, her cleaning, her appearance, her intelligence. He would contradict her when she tried to discipline me or make decisions about the household, undermining her authority and making it clear that he was the only one whose opinion mattered. I watched my mother shrink into herself more and more each day. The vibrant, loving woman who had raised me was becoming a shadow of her former self. She moved through our house like a ghost, trying to anticipate his needs, trying to avoid his wrath, trying to protect me from the worst of his behavior while dealing with her own pain and fear. The confusion I felt during this time was overwhelming. This was still my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and read me bedtime stories. Part of me kept waiting for him to go back to being the person I remembered, kept hoping that this was just a phase that would pass. I couldn't understand how someone who was supposed to love me could treat me with such cruelty and contempt. I began to believe that maybe I really was the problem. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe if I could just be better, smarter, quieter, more perfect, then he would love me the way he used to. I threw myself into trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect student, the perfect child, hoping that if I could just get everything right, the abuse would stop. But nothing I did was ever enough. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how perfectly I behaved, there was always something wrong, always something to criticize, always some new way that I was disappointing him. I began to understand that the problem wasn't with my behavior, but with something much deeper and more frightening. The fear became a constant companion during this time. I would wake up each morning with a knot in my stomach, wondering what kind of day it would be, wondering what might set him off, wondering if I would be able to navigate through the hours without triggering his anger. I became hypervigilant, constantly scanning his face for signs of his mood, constantly adjusting my behavior to try to stay safe. School, which had once been my refuge, became harder to focus on. I would sit in class thinking about what was waiting for me at home, worrying about my mother, trying to figure out how to make things better. My grades started to slip, not because I wasn't smart enough, but because my mind was consumed with survival strategies and fear. I began to isolate myself from my friends during this period. How could I explain what was happening at home when I didn't even understand it myself? How could I invite friends over when I never knew what kind of mood my father might be in? How could I act normal and carefree when I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my small shoulders? The emotional toll of living in this environment was enormous. I started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing and my body covered in sweat. I would lie in my bed listening to the sounds of the house, trying to determine if it was safe to go back to sleep or if I needed to stay alert for some new crisis. I began to experience physical symptoms as well. My stomach hurt constantly, and I had no appetite for food. I got frequent headaches that would pound behind my eyes until I felt nauseous. I was tired all the time, but I had trouble falling asleep because my mind wouldn't stop racing with worry and fear. During this time, I started to develop what I now understand were coping mechanisms. I learned to make myself invisible when he was in a bad mood, to disappear into my room or into books or into my own imagination. I created elaborate fantasy worlds in my mind where I was safe and loved and valued, places I could escape to when reality became too painful to bear. I also began to develop a kind of emotional numbness as a way to protect myself. If I didn't feel too deeply, if I didn't hope too much, if I didn't expect too much, then maybe the disappointment and pain wouldn't hurt so badly. I was learning to shut down parts of myself as a survival strategy, though I wouldn't understand the long-term cost of this protection until much later. The house itself began to feel different during this time. What had once been a place of warmth and safety became a place where I had to be constantly on guard. I knew which floorboards creaked and might wake him up if he was napping. I knew which doors slammed too loudly and might irritate him. I knew how to move through my own home like a spy, trying not to draw attention to myself. Dinner time became particularly difficult. We would sit around the same table where we had once shared laughter and stories, but now the atmosphere was tense and unpredictable. I would eat as quickly as possible, hoping to be excused before something went wrong. I learned to read the signs in his posture and expression that meant danger was coming, and I would try to signal to my mother with my eyes when I thought we needed to be extra careful. I want to be clear about something as I share this part of my story with you. Even in the midst of this pain, even as I was learning to survive in an environment that no child should have to endure, there was still a spark inside me that refused to be completely extinguished. There was still a part of me that knew this wasn't right, that knew I deserved better, that knew somehow that this wasn't my fault. That spark would be tested many times in the years to come. It would be buried under layers of fear and shame and confusion, but it never completely disappeared. It was the seed of the strength that would eventually help me escape, the foundation of the healing that would eventually make me whole again. As I tell you this part of my story, I want you to remember that if you are living in a situation like this now, If you are experiencing abuse or watching someone you love being abused, that spark exists in you too. No matter how dark things seem, no matter how powerless you feel, there is strength inside you that cannot be taken away. There is hope, even when hope seems impossible. The abuse was just beginning during this period of my life, and it would get much worse before it got better. But I survived it, and if you are facing something similar, you can survive it too. You are stronger than you know, and you deserve love and safety and respect. Hold on to that truth, even when everything around you seems to contradict it. Hold on to that spark, because it will light your way to freedom. As I moved into my early teenage years, around 12 or 13, the abuse in our home escalated to levels that I never could have imagined when I was that innocent little girl playing in our backyard. What had started as occasional harsh words and emotional manipulation had grown into something much more sinister and pervasive. The man I had once called Daddy had become someone I barely recognized, someone whose very presence in our house filled me with dread. The abuse was no longer just random outbursts triggered by bad days at work or minor irritations. It had become systematic, calculated, and constant. My father seemed to wake up each morning looking for reasons to find fault, searching for opportunities to tear down my mother and me. The verbal attacks became more vicious, more personal, designed not just to criticize, but to destroy our sense of self-worth entirely. He would wait for moments when we were feeling even slightly happy or relaxed, and then he would pounce with a cruelty that took my breath away. If my mother was humming while she cooked dinner, he would tell her that her voice was irritating and ask her why she always had to make noise. If I was laughing at something on television, he would inform me that my laugh was too loud and annoying, that I sounded like a hyena, that no one would ever want to be around someone who made such unpleasant sounds. The psychological tactics he used became more sophisticated and more damaging. He would play mind games that left me questioning my own sanity, my own memories, my own perceptions of reality. He would deny saying things that I clearly remembered him saying, insisting that I was making things up or remembering incorrectly. He would change rules and expectations without warning, then punish me for not following guidelines that he had never actually established. One particularly devastating technique he used was to build me up slightly, just enough to give me hope, and then tear me down even more brutally than before. He might compliment my appearance one day, making me feel pretty and valued, only to spend the next week pointing out every flaw he could find, telling me I was ugly and awkward, and that no one would ever love me. These cycles of false hope, followed by crushing disappointment, were almost worse than constant criticism would have been. The physical environment of our home began to reflect the emotional violence that was taking place within its walls. He would slam doors so hard that the pictures on the walls would shake. He would throw things when he was angry, not necessarily at us, but in our direction, creating an atmosphere of constant threat and intimidation. He would punch walls, leaving holes that served as permanent reminders of his capacity for violence. I began to understand that the abuse was escalating in ways that terrified me. While he had not yet crossed certain lines, I could feel him testing boundaries, pushing closer to forms of violence that I couldn't even allow myself to imagine. The way he looked at me sometimes, the way he would stand too close when he was angry, the way his hands would clench into fists when he was yelling, all of it told me that worse things were possible, maybe even inevitable. My mother was bearing the brunt of much of his rage during this period. He would berate her for hours at a time, following her from room to room as she tried to escape his verbal assault. He criticized everything about her, from the way she kept house, to the way she raised me, to the way she looked and spoke and breathed. He told her she was worthless, that she was lucky he stayed with her because no other man would want her, that she was a burden and a disappointment. Watching what he did to my mother was almost worse than enduring what he did to me directly. She had been my protector, my source of comfort and love, and seeing her reduced to a trembling, fearful shadow of herself filled me with a rage and helplessness that I didn't know how to process. I wanted to defend her, to stand up to him, to make him stop, but I was just a child, and he had made it very clear that any interference from me would only make things worse for both of us. It was during this dark period that I discovered the ultimate betrayal, the revelation that would shatter whatever remaining illusions I had about my father and our family. I learned that he was having an affair, that he was betraying not only my mother's trust, but the sacred bonds of our family. The discovery came by accident, but once I knew, I couldn't unknow it, and the knowledge sat in my stomach like a poison that I couldn't expel. I had been walking home from school one afternoon when I saw his car parked outside a house in a neighborhood where we didn't know anyone. Something about the way it was hidden, tucked behind some trees where it wouldn't be easily visible from the street, made me curious. I crept closer, my heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and fear, and I saw him through a window with a woman I didn't recognize, holding her in a way that he never held my mother anymore. The sight hit me like a physical blow. This was the man who stood in church every Sunday, who presented himself to our community as a devoted family man, who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience from my mother and me while he was secretly living a lie. The hypocrisy was staggering. But even more devastating was the realization of what this betrayal would do to my mother if she found out. I carried this secret for weeks, the knowledge burning inside me like acid. I watched my mother continue to try to please him, to make him happy, to save a marriage that he was actively destroying behind her back. I saw her blame herself for his anger and his distance, never knowing that his heart and attention were focused on another woman entirely. The internal conflict I experienced during this time was almost unbearable. Part of me wanted to tell my mother what I had seen, to warn her, to give her the information she needed to make her own decisions about our family. But another part of me was terrified of what would happen if I spoke up. Would he deny it and convince her that I was lying? Would he become even more violent if his secret was exposed? Would our family completely fall apart, leaving us with nowhere to go and no way to survive? I was just a child being forced to make adult decisions about impossible situations. The weight of these secrets and this knowledge was crushing me, but I felt like I had no choice but to carry it alone. I couldn't burden my mother with this information when she was already struggling to survive each day. I couldn't confide in friends or teachers because I was too ashamed and too afraid of the consequences. The betrayal went beyond just the infidelity, though that was devastating enough. It was the complete destruction of everything I had believed about love, about family, about the promises that people make to each other. If my father could lie so completely about something so fundamental, what else was he lying about? If he could betray the woman who had given him everything, who had stood by him through everything, what did that say about his capacity for love or loyalty? I began to understand that the man I had once trusted with my life was not just cruel, but fundamentally dishonest. Everything about our family, everything about the image he presented to the world, was built on lies and deception. The realization that I had been living in a house of lies for years made me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my world. The psychological manipulation became even more twisted once I knew about his affair. When he would criticize my mother, when he would tell her that she wasn't good enough, when he would make her feel like she was the reason for his unhappiness, I knew that it was all projection and lies. He was the one destroying our family, but he was making her believe that she was to blame. This period of my life taught me about the devastating power of secrets and lies. Living with the knowledge of his betrayal while watching my mother suffer from self-doubt and self-blame was like carrying poison in my body every day. I felt complicit in his deception simply by knowing about it and not speaking up, but I also felt powerless to change anything by revealing what I knew. The isolation I felt during this time was complete and overwhelming. I couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening in our home because the truth was too horrible and too complicated. I couldn't find comfort in my mother because she was struggling with her own pain, and I didn't want to add to her burdens. I couldn't trust my father with anything because I now knew the depth of his capacity for deception and cruelty. I began to have thoughts during this period that scared me. I wondered if all families were like this behind closed doors, if all fathers treated their wives and children with such cruelty, if this was just what adult relationships looked like. I wondered if I was destined to repeat these patterns, if I would grow up to be either an abuser or a victim, because that was all I had ever known. But even in the midst of this darkness, even as I felt like I was drowning in secrets and pain and betrayal, there was still something inside me that refused to accept that this was all there was. There was still a voice, small but persistent, that told me this wasn't normal, this wasn't right, this wasn't what I deserved. That voice would become my lifeline, my guide toward freedom, my reminder that another life was possible. As I share this part of my story with you, I want you to know that if you are living with secrets that feel too heavy to carry, if you are watching someone you love being betrayed or abused, if you feel trapped in a situation that seems impossible to escape, that voice of truth exists in you too. Trust it, listen to it. Let it guide you toward safety and healing, even when the path seems unclear. The betrayal and escalation I experienced during this period of my life would get even worse before I found my way out. But I want you to remember, as I tell you these dark chapters of my story, that I did find my way out. I did escape. I did heal. And you can too. There comes a moment in every survivor's story when something fundamental shifts inside them, when the part of them that has been enduring and adapting and trying to make things work finally says enough. For me, that moment came when I was about 14 years old, after years of escalating abuse and the crushing weight of secrets that I could no longer carry alone. It wasn't one dramatic event that broke me, but rather the accumulation of countless small betrayals and cruelties that finally reached a tipping point. I remember the exact moment when I realized that I could no longer continue living the way we had been living. It was a Tuesday evening in late autumn, and I was sitting at my desk trying to do homework while the sounds of another argument drifted up from downstairs. This had become such a common occurrence that I had learned to tune it out, to focus on my schoolwork while my parents destroyed each other with words in the rooms below me. But something about this argument was different. I could hear my mother crying, really crying, not just the quiet tears that she usually tried to hide, but deep, broken sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. I set down my pencil and crept to the top of the stairs, listening to words that I wish I could forget but that are burned into my memory forever. My father was telling her that she was pathetic, that she was weak, that she disgusted him. He was telling her that no one could ever love someone like her, that she was lucky he stayed with her out of pity. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told her that maybe it would be better for everyone if she just disappeared, if she just stopped existing, if the world could be rid of her worthless presence. I watched my mother collapse into a chair, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs, and in that moment I saw something in her eyes that terrified me more than all of his anger ever had. I saw defeat. I saw surrender. I saw someone who was beginning to believe that maybe he was right, maybe the world would be better without her in it. That was the moment when I understood that if I didn't do something, if I didn't find a way to change our situation, I was going to lose my mother. Not just to divorce or separation, but to something much more permanent and devastating. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt, filling me with a clarity and determination that I had never experienced before. I couldn't continue to be a passive observer in my own life, watching the people I loved being destroyed while I hoped that somehow things would magically get better. I couldn't keep carrying secrets and hoping that if I just survived long enough, he would change back into the father I remembered from my early childhood. I had to accept that the man who was terrorizing our family was not going to transform into someone loving and kind without outside intervention. The next few weeks were filled with a strange sense of purpose that I had never felt before. I began to observe our situation with new eyes, not as a victim trying to survive from day to day, but as someone who was planning an escape. I started paying attention to patterns in his behavior, to times when he was gone from the house, to resources that might be available to us if we needed to leave. I spent hours at the library after school, not just doing homework but researching domestic violence, learning about shelters and support services, trying to understand the legal options that might be available to my mother and me. I was amazed to discover that what we were experiencing had a name, that there were other families going through similar situations, that there were people whose job it was to help women and children escape from abusive homes. The more I learned, the more I understood that leaving would not be simple or easy. I read about how dangerous it could be for women to leave abusive relationships, about how the risk of violence often increased when the abuser felt like he was losing control. I learned about the economic challenges that women faced when they tried to start over with no money and no job skills, about the legal battles that could drag on for years. But I also learned about strength and courage and survival. I read stories of women who had escaped situations even worse than ours, who had rebuilt their lives and found safety and happiness on the other side of their trauma. These stories gave me hope that escape was possible, that we didn't have to accept this life as our permanent reality. The hardest part of this period was keeping my plans secret while watching my mother sink deeper into despair. She had become increasingly isolated, rarely leaving the house except for necessary errands, rarely speaking unless spoken to, moving through our home like a ghost. I wanted to tell her what I was planning, to give her hope, but I was terrified that she might accidentally reveal something to him or that she might try to talk me out of taking action. I began to document what was happening in our house, keeping a secret journal hidden in my school locker where I recorded the worst of his verbal attacks, the threats he made, the signs of his escalating violence. I took pictures of the holes he had punched in walls, of broken objects that he had thrown in his rage. I saved money from my part-time job babysitting, hiding it in a place where he would never think to look. The internal conflict I felt during this time was enormous. Part of me still loved the man he had been when I was little, still hoped that somehow I could find a way to fix our family without having to tear it apart completely. I felt guilty for planning to leave him, for thinking about my mother and me starting over somewhere else without him. Despite everything he had done, he was still my father, and the idea of cutting him out of our lives forever felt like a betrayal of the love I had once felt for him. But a stronger part of me understood that love without safety was not really love at all. I began to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to remove them from a situation where they are being destroyed, even if they don't understand or appreciate your actions at the time. I realized that saving my mother might require me to make decisions that she was too broken to make for herself. The planning phase taught me skills that I never should have had to learn as a teenager. I learned how to hide money and important documents, how to research legal services and shelters, how to create safety plans and escape routes. I learned how to have conversations with social workers and counselors without revealing too much about what was happening at home, how to ask for help in ways that wouldn't immediately trigger investigations that might make our situation more dangerous. I also learned about my own capacity for strength and courage during this time. I discovered that I was much braver than I had ever imagined, much more resourceful and determined than I had known. The scared little girl who had once hidden in her room during his rages was growing into a young woman who was willing to fight for her survival and her mother's safety. The decision to take action wasn't made lightly or quickly. I spent months weighing the risks and benefits, considering every possible outcome, trying to anticipate what might go wrong and how I could protect us from the worst-case scenarios. I knew that leaving could be dangerous, but I also knew that staying was slowly killing us both. The final push came when I realized that my mother was beginning to show signs of giving up entirely. She had stopped taking care of herself, stopped eating regular meals, stopped engaging with the world around her in any meaningful way. I could see her fading away before my eyes, and I understood that if I didn't act soon, I might lose her forever to the despair that he had systematically created in her mind and heart. One evening, after he had been particularly cruel to both of us during dinner, I found my mother sitting in her bedroom, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face but making no sound. When I asked her what was wrong, she looked at me with eyes that seemed completely empty and said that she didn't know how much longer she could keep going, that maybe he was right about her being worthless. That night, I made the final decision to put my escape plan into action. I couldn't wait any longer for the perfect moment or the ideal circumstances. My mother was drowning, and I was the only one who could throw her a lifeline. I had to find the courage to take the unthinkable step of breaking apart our family in order to save what was left of our lives. The plan I had developed was simple but risky. I would wait for a day when he was at work and had meetings that would keep him busy for several hours. I would help my mother pack only the most essential items, and we would leave together to go to a shelter that I had already contacted and that had agreed to help us. We would take only what we could carry, leaving behind most of our possessions but hopefully taking our lives and our safety with us. I knew that once we left, there would be no going back. I knew that he would be furious, that he would try to find us, that he might try to hurt us or manipulate us into returning. I knew that we would face financial hardship and legal battles and the challenge of starting completely over with nothing but each other. But I also knew that staying meant accepting a slow death of the spirit, watching my mother disappear completely and possibly facing even worse violence as his behavior continued to escalate. The choice between the known danger of staying and the unknown risks of leaving was really no choice at all. As I made these final preparations, I felt a sense of power and purpose that I had never experienced before. For the first time in years, I was not just surviving, but taking active control of my destiny. I was no longer a victim waiting for someone else to save me, but a survivor taking responsibility for my own safety and my mother's protection. The scared little girl who had once trusted completely in her father's love and protection was gone forever, but in her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that real love requires courage, that real protection sometimes means making difficult choices, that real family is not defined by blood but by care and respect and safety. I want you to understand, as I share this part of my story, that finding the strength to leave an abusive situation is one of the hardest things a person can do. If you are in a similar situation now, please know that the fear you feel about leaving is normal and valid, but also know that staying is not your only option, that help is available, and that you are stronger and more capable than you realize. The breaking point is different for everyone, but it usually comes when the pain of staying becomes greater than the fear of leaving. When you reach that point, trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust your strength, and know that on the other side of that terrifying leap into the unknown, there is freedom waiting for you. The day we finally left our house was both the most terrifying and the most liberating day of my life up to that point. I was 15 years old, standing in the doorway of what had been my home for my entire life, holding 2 suitcases that contained everything my mother and I could carry. Behind us lay years of pain and fear and broken dreams. Ahead of us lay complete uncertainty, but also the possibility of freedom and healing that I had only dared to dream about. The women's shelter that became our first safe haven was nothing like what I had imagined. It was a simple, modest building in a part of town I had never visited before, but the moment we walked through those doors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt safe. There were other women there, other children, all with their own stories of survival and escape, and for the first time in my life, I understood that we were not alone in what we had experienced. The first few weeks at the shelter were incredibly difficult. My mother was in a state of shock, barely able to function or make decisions about even the smallest things. The woman who had once run our household with such care and efficiency could barely remember to eat meals or change her clothes. The trauma of finally leaving, combined with years of psychological abuse, had left her in a kind of emotional paralysis that frightened me almost as much as my father's violence had. I found myself taking on responsibilities that no teenager should have to carry. I was the one who spoke to the social workers and counselors, who filled out paperwork for assistance programs, who made sure my mother took her medication and attended her therapy appointments. In many ways, our roles had reversed, and I became the caretaker while she worked through the process of remembering who she was outside of the abuse. The counselors at the shelter explained to me that what my mother was experiencing was normal, that many abuse survivors go through a period of profound disorientation when they first escape. They told me that her mind and spirit needed time to heal from years of trauma, that recovery was possible but that it would take patience and professional help and a lot of love and support. I began attending counseling sessions myself during this time, something I had never imagined I would need or want. The idea of talking to a stranger about our private family business felt wrong and scary at first. I had spent so many years keeping secrets, protecting our family's image, that the thought of revealing the truth about what had happened felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught. But my counselor, a gentle woman named Dr. Martinez, created a space where I felt safe enough to finally tell the truth about what our lives had been like. For the first time, I was able to say out loud that what had happened to us was wrong, that it wasn't our fault, that we deserved to be treated with love and respect. Hearing those words spoken aloud, and having someone believe me completely, was like taking the first real breath I had taken in years. Through counseling, I began to understand the long-term effects that living in an abusive environment had on my development and my sense of self. I learned about trauma responses, about hypervigilance, about the ways that chronic stress can affect a young person's brain and emotional development. I started to understand that many of the behaviors I had developed for survival, while necessary at the time, were no longer serving me in this new, safer environment. The process of unlearning survival behaviors and learning to trust again was slow and sometimes frustrating. I had become so accustomed to scanning people's faces for signs of anger, to modifying my behavior based on other people's moods, to making myself small and invisible when I sensed tension, that I didn't know how to just be myself without constantly calculating the safest way to exist in any given moment. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that healing wasn't just about forgetting what had happened or moving on from the past. It was about integrating those experiences into my understanding of myself and the world in a way that gave me power rather than keeping me trapped. She taught me that my survival skills, while no longer necessary for safety, were actually evidence of my strength and resilience and intelligence. One of the most important things I learned during this time was that I was not responsible for fixing my mother or managing her healing process. As much as I loved her and wanted to help her, I was still a teenager who needed to focus on my own recovery and development. This was one of the hardest lessons for me to accept, because I had become so accustomed to feeling responsible for everyone else's well-being. The shelter provided us with more than just a safe place to sleep. They connected us with legal services to help with the divorce proceedings and restraining orders. They helped my mother find job training programs and eventually part-time work that would allow us to become financially independent. They provided childcare and tutoring services that helped me stay caught up with my schoolwork despite all the upheaval in our lives. Most importantly, they surrounded us with a community of people who understood what we had been through because they had survived similar experiences themselves. I met other teenagers who had escaped abusive homes, other mothers who were rebuilding their lives after leaving dangerous relationships. Their stories gave me hope, and their strength inspired me to keep moving forward, even when the healing process felt overwhelming. I remember one woman at the shelter, Maria, who had left her abusive husband with 3 young children and no money or job skills. When I met her, she had been working 2 jobs while going to nursing school at night, determined to create a better life for her family. She told me that the first year after leaving was the hardest year of her life, but that every year since then had been better than the one before. Maria became like an older sister to me during our time at the shelter. She taught me practical skills like how to budget money and how to cook simple, nutritious meals. But more importantly, she showed me what it looked like to rebuild your life from nothing, to refuse to be defined by what had been done to you, to create hope and joy and success out of the ashes of trauma. The legal process of divorce and establishing safety protections was long and complicated, and sometimes re-traumatizing. We had to relive many of the worst moments of our experience through court testimony and legal documents. My father hired lawyers who tried to paint my mother as unstable and me as a troubled teenager who was lying about what had happened in our home. But we had allies in this fight. The shelter's legal advocates helped us prepare for court appearances and made sure we understood our rights and options. The documentation I had secretly gathered during those months of planning our escape proved invaluable in establishing a pattern of abuse and intimidation. The counselors who had worked with us provided professional testimony about the effects of domestic violence on families. Slowly, we began to win small victories in the legal system. Restraining orders were granted and enforced. Financial support was established that would help us transition to independence. Most importantly, the court recognized that what had happened in our home was real and serious, and that we deserved protection and support as we rebuilt our lives. The process of finding our own apartment and starting to live independently was both exciting and terrifying. After months of living in the structured environment of the shelter, the idea of being responsible for our own safety and well-being felt overwhelming. But it also felt like a crucial step toward reclaiming our autonomy and building the life we wanted to have. Our first apartment was small and modest, furnished mostly with donations and second-hand items, but it was ours. I will never forget the first night we spent there, just my mother and me, sitting on our donated couch eating takeout pizza and watching television without having to worry about anyone's mood or anger or disapproval. The silence in our home was peaceful instead of tense, and I realized that I had forgotten what that felt like. My mother's healing process was gradual but steady. With the help of therapy and medication and the support of other survivors, she slowly began to remember who she was before the abuse. I watched her rediscover her love of gardening, her talent for crafts, her ability to laugh at silly movies. It was like watching someone come back to life after being underground for years. She started volunteering at the shelter where we had first found safety, helping other women who were just beginning their own journeys toward freedom. Watching her use her experience to help others was incredibly healing for both of us. It transformed her trauma from something that had only caused pain into something that could also create meaning and purpose and hope. My own healing process involved learning to trust my own perceptions and feelings again. I had spent so many years doubting myself, questioning whether what I was experiencing was real or normal, that I had lost confidence in my own ability to interpret the world around me. Therapy helped me understand that my instincts were actually very good, that I had been right to feel scared and angry and protective of my mother. I began to excel in school in ways that I never had before. Without the constant stress and distraction of living in an abusive environment, I was able to focus my intelligence and energy on learning and growing. My grades improved dramatically, and I started to think about possibilities for my future that I had never dared to imagine before. The support systems that surrounded us during this time were crucial to our healing. Beyond the formal services provided by the shelter and social services, we found support in unexpected places. Neighbors who brought us meals when we first moved into our apartment, teachers who stayed after school to help me catch up on coursework I had missed, a church community that welcomed us without judgment and provided practical assistance as we rebuilt our lives. I learned during this time that healing is not a linear process. There were days when I felt strong and confident and proud of how far we had come. But there were also days when I felt overwhelmed by anger or sadness or fear about the future. I learned that having bad days didn't mean I was failing at recovery, that setbacks were a normal part of the healing process. One of the most important realizations I had during this period was that I was not broken by what I had experienced. I had been hurt, yes, and traumatized, but I was not fundamentally damaged or ruined. The strength that had helped me plan our escape, the love that had motivated me to protect my mother, the intelligence that had guided me through the legal and practical challenges of starting over, all of that came from within me and could not be taken away by anyone else's cruelty. As I share this part of my story with you, I want you to understand that healing is possible, even from the worst trauma, even when the damage seems too deep to repair. It takes time and support and professional help, but human beings have an incredible capacity for recovery and growth and transformation. If you are just beginning your own healing journey, please be patient with yourself. Trust the process, even when it feels slow or difficult. Seek help from people who understand trauma and abuse. Surround yourself with people who believe in your strength and your worth. And remember that every day you survive, every step you take toward freedom, every moment you choose hope over despair, you are proving to yourself and to the world that you are stronger than whatever tried to break you. As I sit here today, many years after that terrified 15-year-old girl walked out of an abusive home carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a determination to survive, I want to share with you what I have learned about healing, about strength, about the incredible capacity human beings have to transform pain into purpose and trauma into triumph. The journey from that broken, frightened teenager to the woman I am today was not easy or quick or straightforward. There were setbacks and struggles, moments when I wanted to give up, times when the pain felt too overwhelming to bear. But I want you to know that every step of that journey was worth it, because it led me to this moment where I can speak to you with strength in my voice and peace in my heart. I am now a woman in my 60s, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the abuse and betrayal I experienced no longer defines me. Those experiences are part of my story, part of what shaped me into who I am, but they do not control my life or limit my possibilities or determine my worth. I have learned that we are so much more than the worst things that have happened to us. The relationship with my mother, which was so damaged and complicated during those dark years, became one of the most beautiful and healing aspects of my life. She lived to be 82 years old, and we spent those decades after our escape building the kind of loving, supportive relationship that every mother and daughter deserves to have. We traveled together, laughed together, created new memories that slowly outweighed the painful ones from our past. My mother became an advocate for other survivors of domestic violence, using her experience to help women who were just beginning their own journeys toward freedom. She spoke at shelters and support groups, sharing her story and proving to other women that it was possible to rebuild a life after abuse, that it was never too late to start over, that they deserved love and respect and safety, no matter what anyone had told them. Watching her transform from a broken, defeated woman into someone who radiated strength and compassion was one of the greatest gifts of my life. It showed me that healing is not just about surviving trauma, but about using that survival to create meaning and purpose and hope for others who are still struggling. I went on to finish high school and then college, something that would never have been possible if we had stayed in that abusive environment. I became a social worker myself, dedicating my career to helping children and families who were experiencing situations similar to what my mother and I had endured. I found that my personal experience with trauma, rather than being a limitation, actually made me more effective at my job because I could understand and connect with my clients in ways that someone who had never experienced abuse could not. I married a wonderful man when I was 25 years old, someone who showed me what healthy love actually looks like. Building that relationship required me to learn how to trust again, how to be vulnerable without being afraid, how to receive love without constantly waiting for it to be taken away. My husband was patient with my healing process, understanding that some scars take a long time to fade, that some fears take years to overcome. Together, we raised 3 children who grew up in a home filled with love and respect and safety. Breaking the cycle of abuse that had been passed down through generations of my family became one of my greatest accomplishments. My children never had to wonder if they were safe in their own home, never had to walk on eggshells around their parents, never had to choose between protecting themselves and protecting someone they loved. The relationship with my father was something I struggled with for many years after our escape. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to find a way to rebuild some kind of connection with him. But I learned through therapy and experience that forgiveness does not require reconciliation, that I could let go of anger and resentment without putting myself back in danger or accepting unacceptable behavior. He never acknowledged what he had done to our family, never took responsibility for the pain he had caused, never showed genuine remorse or made efforts to change his behavior. I came to understand that my healing did not depend on his acknowledgement or apology, that I could find peace without his permission or participation. As I reflect on my journey, I want to address those of you who might be watching this and recognizing your own story in mine. If you are living in an abusive situation right now, if you are being hurt by someone who claims to love you, if you are feeling trapped and hopeless and alone, I want you to know that you are stronger than you realize and that help is available. The fear you feel about leaving is real and valid. Abuse is designed to make you feel powerless, to convince you that you have no options, that you deserve what is happening to you, that no one will believe you or help you if you try to escape. These are lies that abusers tell to maintain control, but they are not truth. You do have options, even when it feels like you don't. You do deserve to be treated with love and respect and kindness, no matter what anyone has told you. You are not responsible for someone else's violence, or cruelty, or inability to control their behavior. You did not cause the abuse, you cannot cure it, and you cannot control it, but you can choose to save yourself. There are people whose job it is to help you find safety and resources and support. There are shelters and hotlines and legal advocates and counselors who understand what you are going through because they have helped thousands of other survivors escape from similar situations. You do not have to figure this out alone or handle everything by yourself. I know that taking the first step toward getting help can feel impossible. I know that the fear of making things worse can be overwhelming. I know that leaving might mean giving up financial security or comfortable living situations or relationships with people you love. But I also know that staying in an abusive situation will slowly destroy your spirit, your health, your sense of self, and possibly your life. If you have children who are witnessing the abuse, please understand that they are being hurt even if they are not being directly targeted. Children who grow up in violent homes suffer trauma that affects their development, their relationships, their ability to trust and love and feel safe in the world. Protecting them requires protecting yourself, and sometimes that means making the difficult decision to leave. For those of you who know someone who is being abused, who suspect that a friend or family member or coworker is in danger, please don't ignore the signs or assume that it's not your business. You don't have to fix the situation or rescue anyone, but you can let them know that you see what is happening, that you believe them, that you care about their safety, and that help is available when they are ready. Sometimes just knowing that one person believes you and supports you can make the difference between staying trapped and finding the courage to seek help. Sometimes having one person who refuses to pretend that everything is fine can plant the seed of hope that a different life is possible. I want to share some specific resources with you. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you can reach them by calling 1-800-799-7233. They have trained counselors who can help you create a safety plan, find local resources, and connect you with services in your area. If you cannot safely make a phone call, you can also visit their website or text START to 88788. There are ways to get help even if you cannot speak openly about your situation. These services are free and confidential, and they will not judge you or pressure you to make decisions you are not ready to make. For those of you who are in the early stages of healing after escaping an abusive relationship, I want you to know that the confusion and pain and fear you are feeling right now are normal parts of the recovery process. Healing is not linear, and there will be good days and bad days, moments of strength and moments of doubt. Be patient with yourself as you learn to trust your own perceptions again, as you rediscover who you are outside of the abuse, as you build new relationships and create new dreams for your future. Give yourself credit for the courage it took to leave, for the strength it takes to start over, for the hope it requires to believe that something better is possible. Seek professional help from counselors who understand trauma and abuse. Surround yourself with people who support your healing and believe in your worth. Take things one day at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time if necessary. And remember that every moment you survive, every choice you make towards safety and healing, is a victory worth celebrating. To those of you who are watching this and have never experienced abuse yourselves, I ask you to be allies to survivors in your community. Learn the signs of domestic violence so you can recognize when someone needs help. Support organizations that provide services to survivors. Believe women and children when they tell you they are being hurt, even if the abuse is happening behind closed doors in families that seem perfect from the outside. Challenge attitudes and beliefs that excuse or minimize abuse, that blame victims for what happens to them, that suggest that domestic violence is a private family matter that outsiders should not get involved in. Abuse thrives in silence and secrecy, and it can only be stopped when communities refuse to tolerate it. As I close this story, I want you to remember that my journey from victim to survivor to thriver is not unique or special. Millions of people have walked similar paths, have found the strength to escape dangerous situations, have rebuilt their lives from nothing and created something beautiful and meaningful and whole. You have that same strength inside you, even if you cannot feel it right now. You have that same capacity for healing and growth and transformation, even if it seems impossible from where you are sitting today. You deserve love and respect and safety and joy, not because of anything you have done or achieved, but simply because you are a human being with inherent worth and dignity. Your story does not have to end with the chapter you are living right now. There can be new chapters filled with hope and healing and happiness. There can be relationships built on trust and respect. There can be days when you wake up feeling safe and loved and grateful for the life you have created for yourself. I am living proof that this is possible. My mother was living proof that it is never too late to start over. The thousands of survivors who have shared their stories and rebuilt their lives are living proof that human beings have an incredible capacity to heal and grow and thrive after even the worst trauma. If my story has given you hope, if it has helped you feel less alone, if it has inspired you to take one small step towards safety or healing, then sharing these painful memories has been worth it. You are worth fighting for. Your life is worth saving. Your future is worth believing in. Please reach out for help if you need it. Please support others who are struggling if you can. Please remember that together, we are stronger than anything that tries to break us. Together, we can break the cycles of violence and abuse that have hurt too many families for too many generations. Together, we can create a world where every person feels safe and loved and valued, where every child grows up knowing that they matter, where every family is built on foundations of respect and kindness rather than fear and control. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about survivors. Thank you for being part of the solution. And remember, if you are in crisis right now, help is available. You are not alone. You are stronger than you know. And there is hope, always hope, for a better tomorrow.